The rain started before sunset and did not stop. It slid down the roofs and poured from the gutters and made the street lamps look like pale moons behind water. Jack pulled his hood tighter and kept walking because he could not go home yet. Home was an apartment with boxes in the hall and a chair that still held his mother's scarf. Home was quiet in a way that felt like falling. He counted the steps to distract his mind, but the numbers lost shape and his throat tightened. He kept to the narrow road that curved past the school and the bakery and the little church with a bell that had not rung all week. People said that old house at the edge of the woods was a place to avoid. Kids told stories about it. They said it whispered at night, or that shadows moved in the top window. Jack had laughed at those stories once because they were easy to laugh at with friends under the noon sun. But he was alone now in the wet evening, and the laughter was far away. He came to the fence around the property and paused. The boards leaned like tired men. The gate hung open. Beyond it, the yard was tall grass and broken stone. The house was big but tired too, with flaking paint and shutters that had lost their screws, and a porch that sagged as if it had taken a long breath and then forgotten how to exhale. The storm blew harder and pushed cold needles under his hood. He could turn back, but he did not want to go home yet, and he did not want to walk the streets any longer. He stepped through the gate and told himself the wind would be less under the porch roof. The boards creaked. The door had a crack across it like a scar, and the handle was loose. Someone long ago had put a braided rope on it. He touched the rope and felt the damp deep in the fibers. He pushed. The door did not open at first. He leaned his shoulder and pushed again, and it slid with a sound like a groan. The smell met him first. It was dust and old wood and something sweet like dried flowers, maybe a perfume that had spilled long ago and never left. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The storm became a muffled drum. He stood still so his eyes could adjust. The entryway was wide and there were framed pictures on the walls, but the glass had fogged and the faces were only shapes. A hall led toward the back. A staircase rose to the right. The carpet runner was worn down the center like a path made by years of feet that no longer passed there. He did not plan to explore. He only wanted a dry corner until the rain softened. But the house held a quiet that was not empty, and he felt pulled forward the way one feels pulled by a melody. When the first few notes are right, he moved down the hall where shadows floated like slow birds. He reached a door that stood ajar and pushed it open with his foot. The room beyond had tall windows and heavy curtains and a thin layer of dust that held the shape of his footprints as soon as he stepped inside. And there, in the far corner, near the last window, sat a piano. Jack did not move right away. He felt something inside him step forward and stop at the same time. The piano was a dark upright, the kind with carved legs and a closed lid. Its finish was dull, and its edges wore small chips, as if time had been nibbling. A lace runner lay across the top, and a vase stood at one end, empty and tipped toward a stack of yellowed sheet music. It was not a grand instrument, and yet it felt grand to him because it was here, because it had survived, because it was the first real piano he had seen up close since the hospital. His hands went cold and warm at once. He crossed the room and set his backpack down. He lifted the lid and set it back gently. The keys were there, white and black, not clean but not ruined. He pressed one with the tip of his finger, and a small sound came out and hung in the air like a bead of light. He pressed another and another. Some keys rumbled. Some were dull. A few stuck and freed themselves with a sigh. He sat on the bench. It groaned but held him. His hands hovered over the keyboard and did not know if they were allowed to do what they wanted to do. When his mother had been well, she would come home from work and tie her hair up and flip a pan of onions on the stove and sing under her breath, and sometimes she would hum a tune and ask him to figure it out on the old electric keyboard they kept on a shelf. He could always find it. He could always build the shape of the song with a few notes, and then more notes until it fit what she had in her head. "You have a good ear," she would say, and her eyes would soften like the onions in the pan. After she got sick, the singing stopped. The keyboard stayed on the shelf, but when he touched it at night in his room, the sound felt thin and useless. When she died, the keyboard went into a box with her scarves and her teacup and the little glass bird he had made for her in art class. Since the funeral he had not touched a single key. Now his fingers trembled. He thought of her voice when it was strong and when it was weak. He thought of the last thing she had asked him to do, which was promised he would keep playing. Whatever that meant for him, and he had nodded and said he would, and then he had put the keyboard in the box anyway. because grief made simple promises feel heavy and far away. He placed his left hand on the lower keys and his right hand on the middle, and he pressed a pattern he knew by heart. Just 3 notes in the right hand and 2 in the left that made a shape like a doorway. The sound came out richer than he expected. The piano was old, but it had a voice. The wood held echoes. The strings gave what they had. He played the 3 notes again, and then found the next 3, and the left hand moved, and the shape widened. And a melody that he had not planned came. It was small and honest. It matched the rain. It had room inside it for pain without breaking. He closed his eyes and let it grow. He did not think about technique or about the exact names of the chords. He let his fingers walk like they were learning a room in the dark, and touched each piece of furniture gently so nothing bumped too hard, so nothing fell. The tune became a river through a narrow stone bed. It found ways around small blocks. It rose and fell and rose again. He did not notice the tears at first, because they were warm and they matched the sound and they felt like part of what the notes were doing. He kept going. He felt his breath fall into the rhythm. He felt his shoulders lower, as if someone had lifted 2 stones off them. He kept seeing the hospital room and the white sheets and the smallest smile she had given him in the morning light, and the way she had whispered the word promise, and he answered now with the keys because words had failed him then. The lower notes surprised him with a kind of thunder he did not think the instrument could hold. The higher notes were thin but bright, like the last light at the top of a hill before dusk. He made them answer each other and meet in the middle. The middle felt like the place where he could stand and not fall. He did not know how long he played. The rain went on. Somewhere a shutter banged once, and then twice, and then stopped. The house did not feel empty. It did not feel haunted either. It felt like a space that had waited. He slowed the tempo and let the last notes trail into the soft hush that comes after something true is said. The silence that followed was not blank. It held the shape of what he had played. He opened his eyes. The room looked the same and not the same. Shadows had moved. The windows held watery reflections of street lamps that now glowed in the storm. He wiped his face with his sleeve and laughed once, a small sound, because he had not planned to do any of this, because he had not known there was anything left inside him that could sound like hope. He reached for the lid to close the keys but paused. On the runner across the top of the piano, near the vase, lay a single dried flower pressed inside a book. He had not noticed it before. The book was a slim notebook with a cracked spine, and the paper inside had lines and neat handwriting. He lifted it carefully. The first page had a name written in blue ink and a date from many years ago. The name was Elsie Hart. The date was near the start of autumn, a year before he was born. Under the name a line said, "Pieces for my room." He turned the next page. There were titles and small notes. Autumn at the window. Father comes home. New shoes. He felt the mild shock of stepping into someone else's private room, and he almost closed the book out of respect, but the next page had a short melody written on staff lines and a small drawing of a bird. He tried the notes, and the bird seemed to fly a little in the air above the keys. The melody was sweet and simple. It felt like the beginning of a morning. He played it twice, slower the second time, and the second time it felt like it had found its old home after being away. He turned another page. Elsie had written 2 bars and then crossed them out, and below that had written a question mark and the words, "Try down here," and drawn an arrow to a lower staff. He followed the suggestion, and his left hand moved down, and the sound darkened, and he felt the mood change the way light changes when a cloud passes. He added his own answering phrase at the end because it felt right. He set the book down then and closed the lid halfway to keep dust out, and folded his hands and took a long breath. He whispered thank you, because the room had given him what he needed, and because saying the words out loud made them real again. He looked around. The walls still held frames with clouded glass. He walked closer to one and rubbed a corner with his sleeve and cleared a triangle of fog, and saw a picture of a girl standing beside this same piano. She wore a dress with a simple belt, and her hair was tied back with a ribbon, and she had the easiest smile. A man stood behind her, maybe her father, with his hand on the top of the piano. They looked like they were not just posing but laughing at a joke that had been said right before the photographer called ready. He did not know why his chest hurt when he saw their faces, but it did, and at the same time something in him warmed again like a small stove catching. He looked at other frames. One held a program from a recital at the town hall, the same town hall where they now sold crafts on Saturdays, the program listed names and pieces. Elsie Hart, it said, and next to it the Willow Creek Waltz. He tried to hear it in his mind, but only heard the rain. He returned to the bench and placed his hands on the keyboard again and searched for a waltz shape. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and he found a gentle turn, and then another, and it was not her exact piece. Because he did not know it, but it was an echo of what a waltz in this room could be. He did not feel alone. He felt as if he had stepped into a stream that had flowed before him and would flow after him. His stomach growled and reminded him he had not eaten since lunch. He looked at the time on his phone and saw it was later than he had thought. He should go home and face the chair with the scarf and the boxers and the picture on the mantel and the quiet that waited. A part of him wanted to sleep on the bench and wake to the smell of old wood and begin again, but that was not his house, and he knew he could not stay. He closed the lid and stood. He lifted his backpack. He picked up the notebook and hesitated. It did not feel right to take it. He slid it back where he had found it and pressed it gently so it would not slide off. He went to the door and listened. The storm had eased. The drum on the roof had softened. He turned to look once more at the piano. In the half-light, it looked both humble and brave. He whispered, "I will be back," and the room seemed to hold the promise without judgment. He stepped into the hall and moved toward the front door. As he reached the entryway, he heard a sound behind him, small but clear, like a foot against a loose board or a hand brushing a frame. He froze. The house settled with a faint sigh, or perhaps it was only the wind in the walls. He told himself not to be foolish and started forward again. The second sound was soft too, like someone standing at the threshold of the music room, and, not wanting to be seen, he turned. The hall stretched behind him, dim and grey. The music room doorway was a little darker than the wall. No shape stood there. He waited. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingers. He took a step back down the hall and another. He reached the doorway and peered in. The piano sat quiet. The curtain had shifted a little, letting in a line of light that lay like a bright ribbon across the floor. He held his breath. In the dust next to the bench, his footprints were plain. Beside them was a single mark he had not made, a small oval like the bottom of a cane or the heel of a shoe. It pointed toward the bench, as if someone had stood there very still while he played. The back of his neck prickled, and then the feeling softened because the mark did not feel like a threat. It felt like a witness. He looked to the runner-on, the piano again, and saw that the vase now stood upright when earlier it had been tipped. Maybe he had bumped the bench and jostled the table without noticing. Maybe the wind had moved through the window frame and nudged it with a puff of air. He touched the vase, and it did not wobble. He said goodnight to the room as if it were a person and stepped away. He left the hall and the entry and opened the front door. The rain had thinned to a mist. The night felt washed and lightened. He closed the door behind him, and it held with a tired click. He crossed the porch and went down the steps, and the boards did not complain as loudly as before. He went through the gate and onto the road and turned toward the town. As he walked, he felt something different in his chest. It was not happiness. It was not a relief. It was like a small, clear window had opened, and air could move through. He reached the corner by the church and paused under the lamp. He took out his phone and opened the voice recorder. He hummed the little melody he had found first, the one with 3 notes that made a doorway, and saved the file and named it the rain room. He kept walking. The bakery windows were dark now, but the smell of sugar and butter lingered in the damp, like a memory that had weight. He passed the school and the field where the metal bleachers glistened wet. He reached his building and climbed the stairs, and each step felt like something he could do now, and not something he must force. He opened the apartment door and stood in the doorway and listened to the quiet that had felt like falling earlier. It still waited. He went in and closed the door and turned on a lamp. The chair still held the scarf. He picked it up and pressed it to his face, and then laid it over the back of the chair more neatly. He went to the shelf and took the box with the keyboard things, and opened it not to take the keyboard out, but to take the small glass bird he had made. He set it on the windowsill. He poured water into a cup and drank it, and felt the water travel. Down he stood by the window and listened to the last of the rain tick on the sill. He opened the voice recorder again, and played the humming back, and added a few more notes with his voice, shy and low, to remind himself of where the melody wanted to go. He whispered, "I kept the promise," and then he paused because the words sounded too big and too final. He corrected himself and said, "I began," and that felt true. He turned off the lamp and went to bed and lay on his side and closed his eyes, and the piano keys moved in his mind through the darkness the way a person moves through a house they know by heart. He slept deeper than he had slept since the hospital. In his dream there was a room with tall windows, and a girl with a ribbon in her hair, and a man whose hand rested on the top of a piano. And they were not ghosts. They were people in a memory he had borrowed. The girl nodded toward the bench, and he sat. She put a notebook on the music stand and opened it to a page with a simple waltz. "You found it," she said, and her voice sounded like rain against glass, and morning across a floor. When he awoke just before dawn, the apartment had the soft blue light of a quiet sea. For a heartbeat he did not remember why he felt steadier. Then he saw the glass bird on the sill, and he smiled once. He made tea the way his mother liked it, and let the steam rise into his face. He thought of the house waiting by the woods, and the one mark in the dust near the bench, and he did not feel fear. He felt watched over. He put his hood on again, and picked up his backpack and left for school early. On the way he turned at the fence and looked down the road toward the house he would return to at dusk. He did not know yet that the melody he had found would spread through the town before the week ended. He did not know yet that someone else had stood in the doorway the night before with tears on his face. He only knew the door in his chest had opened a little, and the air moving through was music. The next evening the air was clear, though the ground still held the shine of yesterday's storm. Jack hurried along the road with his hood down this time, the damp breeze against his face. His steps carried more speed than he expected, as if a rope tied his chest to the house at the edge of the woods and tugged him forward. School had ended hours ago, but he had wandered town until dusk, waiting for the right moment to return. He had thought of the piano all day, the sound of its tired but living voice, and he wanted to hear it again, wanted to see if it would still speak to him, or if last night had been only a dream carried by grief. When he reached the broken fence, the gate swung quietly as though it had been waiting for him. He pushed it open and stepped onto the path. The house loomed as before, but tonight it seemed less tired, more expectant. The porch boards sighed under his weight, but not with the same groan. They seemed to recognize his step. He opened the door and stepped into the same scent of dust and old perfume. The silence greeted him like an old friend. He went straight down the hall toward the piano room. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. The piano sat in the same place, dark and steady, as if it had not moved through the years at all. The notebook still lay across the runner. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and pressed them gently. The sound filled the room again, weak in places, strong in others, but alive. His heart softened, and for a moment he closed his eyes, letting the notes flow. This time he tried Elsie's small melody from the book, stitching it with his own. His right hand found bright notes, while his left pulled deeper sounds beneath, shaping a bridge between past and present. The room warmed with music. It felt like sunlight through a dusty window. His chest loosened, and for a while there was nothing but the music and the memory of his mother's voice asking him to promise. But then he felt something. The hairs on his arms rose. The air behind him shifted, the way it does when someone enters quietly. He stopped playing. The last note stretched thin in the silence. Slowly, he turned his head. There in the doorway stood a man. Jack's heart pounded. He thought first of trespassers, of men who came to steal copper pipes from empty houses. But this man was no thief. He was tall, his shoulders bent with age, his face carved deep with lines that looked like they came from more than years. They came from sorrow. His hair was grey and long enough to touch his collar. His eyes were wet in the dim light, reflecting the last glow of evening. Jack froze. The man did not speak right away. He just stood, watching the boy at the piano as though he was staring at a memory returned to life. Finally, his lips parted. His voice was hoarse, but gentle. "You play," he said softly, as if the words themselves might break. Jack swallowed. His hand still rested on the keys, motionless. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to. I just needed a place to." The man raised his hand, stopping him. His eyes never left the piano. "Don't apologize," he murmured. His throat caught that sound. "I thought I would never hear it again." Jack's fear eased, replaced by confusion. He shifted on the bench, unsure if he should leave. But the man stepped into the room, each step heavy but careful, like a man entering a chapel. He came closer to the piano and stood beside it. His hand reached out, trembling, and rested on the top edge of the instrument. His fingers brushed the dust and lingered there, as though touching an old friend. Jack glanced up at him, searching for words. Do you live here?" The man let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Once," he said, "long ago, this was my home." His eyes fell to the keys. "And that piano belonged to my daughter." Jack's stomach tightened. He thought of the photo he had seen behind the dusty glass, the girl with the ribbon, smiling by this very piano. He thought of the notebook with Elsie's name. His mouth went dry. "Elsie," he whispered. The man's head turned sharply. His eyes widened. "You saw her name?" Jack nodded. "In the book." He pointed to the notebook still resting above the keys. The man reached for it with shaking hands, lifted it as though it were made of glass, and pressed it against his chest. His lips trembled. "I thought it was gone. I thought everything was gone." His voice cracked. He stood silent for a moment, eyes closed, holding the book like it was a child. Jack did not know what to say. The air was heavy with the man's grief, and Jack felt it inside himself too, like their sorrows had touched in the room. The man finally lowered the book, his fingers brushing the pages. "She wrote her little tunes here," he said, his voice breaking on the edges. "She played every night. She filled this house with life." And then one evening his voice stopped. His eyes went distant, filled with pain so deep Jack felt it in his own chest. Jack whispered gently, "She died." The man nodded once. His jaw tightened. He blinked rapidly, fighting the tears that still came. "She was 15. A carriage accident. After that, I could not touch this piano. I locked the house. I left. I thought silence would be easier than hearing it without her." His hand stroked the worn wood, but silence was worse. Silence was a grave that stretched forever. Jack felt the words sink into him. He thought of his own silence, the way he had locked away his keyboard, the way he had tried not to hear music after his mother's death. He looked down at his hands on the keys. They were not so different, this man and him. "I lost my mum," Jack whispered. The words tumbled out before he could hold them back. "She always wanted me to play. She made me promise, but I stopped when she died. I couldn't, it hurt too much." The man's eyes fell on him, softened by a shared wound. "And yet, here you are," he said quietly. "And here I am. Two broken hearts drawn back to the same instrument." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the stillness of the house filled the air. Finally, the man pulled a chair closer and sat, laying the notebook gently on his lap. He looked at Jack. "Play again," he said. "Please." Jack hesitated, but the man's eyes begged, not as a command, but as a plea. So Jack lifted his hands to the keys and began again, soft and steady. He played the melody he had built yesterday, stitching Elsie's notes with his own. As the music rose, Jack saw tears slide down the man's face. The old man closed his eyes, and for a moment he was not in the dim, broken house, but somewhere brighter, somewhere filled with the laughter of his daughter. Jack played until his hands grew tired. When the last note faded, the man whispered, "Thank you. You've given her back to me, just for a little while." Jack swallowed, his own eyes wet. Maybe we can keep her here, in the music." The man looked at him long and deep, then nodded slowly. "Yes, maybe we can." The evening grew darker. Shadows stretched long across the floor. Jack knew he should go, but he lingered. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt shared. When he finally stood, the man touched his shoulder gently. "My name is Henry," he said. His voice carried both weight and warmth. Jack nodded. "I'm Jack." Henry looked back at the piano, his hand still resting on it. "Come back tomorrow, Jack. Let's not leave this house in silence again." Jack nodded, and in his chest he felt something stir, something that was not only grief, but hope. As he stepped out into the cool night, the stars above Willow Creek burned brighter than they had in a long time. The next afternoon, Jack found himself staring out the window of his classroom, his pen resting idle above his notebook. The teacher's voice droned on about history, dates, and battles that had turned to dust. Jack's mind wasn't in the room at all. It was at the edge of the woods, in the old house with tall windows and shadows that carried memories. He thought of the piano keys under his hands, of the notebook filled with Elsie's scribbles, and most of all, of Henry the stranger whose grief was carved so deeply into his face it could never be erased. Jack had never seen a man cry before. Not like that. Not tears that weren't born from weakness, but from a wound so deep time couldn't touch it. He had felt Henry's pain in his own chest, as though music itself had braided their losses together. and now he couldn't stop wondering about him. When the bell rang, Jack shoved his books into his bag and slipped out before anyone could stop him. He cut across the field, past the bakery where sugar and butter still lingered faint in the air, and down the road toward the house. The sun was low when he reached the fence. The gate creaked but seemed to welcome him now. He pushed it open, hurried up the porch, and stepped inside. The smell of old perfume and dust met him like an old greeting. Down the hall, the door to the music room was already ajar. He pushed it open and found Henry sitting on the piano bench, his fingers resting on the keys but not pressing them. The old man looked up when Jack entered, his eyes red as if he had been lost in thought or memory. "You came," Henry said. "Softly, I said I would," Jack replied, setting down his backpack. Henry nodded. His shoulders eased, and he patted the bench beside him. Jack sat, their shoulders nearly touching. The piano stood before them like a silent witness, its dust catching the last slant of sunlight. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Henry drew in a slow breath. "I should tell you," he said, his voice cracked on the words. "About Elsie." Jack's heart tightened. He nodded. Henry's single quotes, his hand trembled as it hovered above the keys. "She was the only child I had. Her mother died when she was little, and from then on it was just the two of us. Music became her language, her way of filling the silence in this house. Every evening she would play, and I would sit in the chair by the window and listen. She had such life in her, such joy. Even when we had little money, even when the days were hard, she would make the house sing." Henry pressed a key low, mournful. The sound trembled into the air. "She wrote her own songs," he went on, his voice breaking with pride and grief mixed together. "Silly little tunes. I called them once, though I didn't mean it unkindly. She said she would write one for every moment of her life. The day she got her new shoes. In the morning the birds woke her early, even the times she was sad. She believed music was how feelings could live forever." Jack glanced at the notebook on top of the piano. His throat tightened. He remembered Elsie's handwriting, neat and curious, her little notes in the margins. Henry's eyes glistened. One evening she had a recital at the town hall. She wore a ribbon in her hair, just like in the picture. She played the Willow Creek waltz, the piece she wrote herself. People clapped. They called her gifted. She smiled brighter than I had ever seen. His voice faltered. He pressed another low key. It hummed and lingered like a sigh. Afterward, she wanted to walk home. She said the air felt fresh, and the moon was bright. I told her we should wait for a carriage, but she laughed. She ran ahead, his jaw clenched. The carriage came around the corner too fast. The driver couldn't stop. By the time I reached her, Henry's words broke. His hands fell from the keys into his lap. Tears spilled down his lined cheeks. He covered his face, his shoulders trembling. Jack sat frozen, his own chest aching. He had no words, only the sharp memory of his mother lying pale in the hospital bed, whispering, "Promise me." He felt the same helplessness, the same hollow scream of regret. "I should have made her wait," Henry choked. "I should have kept her safe, a father's job, but I failed. I failed her, Jack." Jack's throat burned. He whispered, "It wasn't your fault." Henry dropped his hands and looked at him, his eyes wild with grief. "Isn't it? I could have stopped her. I could have saved her." Jack swallowed hard. His voice shook. "I know how you feel. My mum, she was sick. I promised I'd play for her. I promised I'd never stop. But when she died, I put the keyboard away. I shut it in a box. I broke my promise. Every day I hear her voice asking me why I didn't keep it." His voice cracked. "I failed her too." The two sat in silence, their grief echoing each other, binding them together. Finally, Henry turned to the piano again. His hand lifted, shaking, and he pressed a single key, then another. The sound was broken, but steady. "Maybe," he whispered, "we can mend our failures here. Maybe playing is not breaking promises, but keeping them late. Perhaps, but keeping them all the same." Jack looked at the keys. Slowly, he lifted his hands and placed them down. His fingers touched the notes Elsie had written, then slipped into his own. The sound rose, soft but strong. Henry closed his eyes and leaned closer, listening. Together, the boy and the old man played. One found his mother again in the chords. The other found his daughter. The house, once filled with silence, filled now with a fragile, trembling hope. When the last note faded, Henry whispered, "Perhaps music is the only way regrets can speak without tearing us apart." Jack nodded. He understood. The days in Willow Creek began to take on a rhythm. Every evening, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the narrow streets, Jack walked the same path that led to the old house by the woods. It was no longer the place people whispered about in fear. For Jack, it had become a refuge, a place where the silence carried memory instead of emptiness, where the music gave voice to pain too heavy for words. Inside, the piano waited. Some nights, Henry would already be seated on the bench, the notebook of Elsie's tunes resting on his lap, his hands trembling above the keys, as if afraid to break the silence. Other nights, Jack arrived first, and the old man would appear in the doorway, his eyes wet, his expression softened by the sound of the boys playing. They said little at first, speaking mostly through music. Jack stitched new melodies into Elsie's notes, while Henry listened, sometimes humming along as if trying to guide the boy with ghosts of memories. One evening, Henry brought a folded cloth with him. He unwrapped it to reveal a photograph, its edges cracked and worn. It showed Elsie, young and bright-eyed, sitting at the piano with her ribbon tied neatly in her hair. Henry placed it on the piano top, his hand trembling. "So she can hear us," he whispered. Jack nodded and played. The photograph watched over them, and the room felt alive. But not everyone in town saw the house that way. The gossip began quietly. Jack heard it first at school whispers that he was sneaking into the haunted house, that he was talking to a ghost. One boy laughed and said he had seen Jack wandering with an old drunk. "That place is cursed." Another sneered, "Leave it alone before it swallows you." Jack ignored them, but the sting of their laughter stayed with him. By the third week, the whispers had spread beyond the school. At the bakery, Mrs. Dalton frowned when she saw Jack covered in dust. "That house is dangerous," she said. "Best leave old shadows where they belong." At the church, an elder shook his head when Henry appeared in the back row one Sunday, muttering that grief had driven the man mad. Even in the marketplace, Jack overheard, "He's filling that boy's head with sorrow. Nothing good will come from stirring the dead." Still, Jack returned each night. Music was the only thing that made sense, but not all the townspeople were content with whispers. A group of local boys, older and mean-spirited, decided to put an end to what they called ghost games. They had no understanding of grief, only of cruelty. It was a windy evening when Jack and Henry sat together, playing side by side. The room glowed with lamplight, the keys echoing their melody through the halls. Then crash, a stone shattered. The window, shards scattered across the floor. Jack leaped up in shock. Henry stumbled back, his hand covering the photograph to protect it. Voices laughed outside. Another stone flew, this time striking the wall with a dull thud. Shouts followed. "Stop feeding ghosts," someone yelled. "That house is rotten." Another voice, harsher, "Burn it down already." Henry's face went pale. He looked at the broken glass glittering across the piano lid, at the picture frame trembling on the edge. Jack clenched his fists, fury burning in his chest. He stormed to the door, but Henry caught his arm. "No," he said firmly, his voice low but urgent. "They don't understand. They're wrecking everything," Jack cried. "We can't just." "They only see ruins," Henry said, his grip shaking on the boy's arm. "They can't hear what we hear." Another crash echoed. This time, the boys outside had climbed onto the porch, pounding on the door. Jack's stomach turned. He could hear their boots stomping, and hear the ugly laughter. "Come out, ghost boy," one taunted. "Sing us a song for the dead." Henry stood frozen. His face carried both rage and sorrow. "This house has suffered. Enough," he whispered. "I won't let them destroy what little remains." The pounding grew louder. The door rattled. Jack felt helpless. He wanted to scream at them, to tell them this place wasn't haunted, that it was alive with memory, with music, with love that refused to die. But words felt small. The boys outside shoved harder. The old door creaked under the strain. Jack braced himself, heart racing. If they came inside, they would smash everything: the piano, Elsie's notebook, even the photograph that meant more to Henry than life itself. And then, just as the wood began to splinter, the storm broke. Thunder boomed overhead. A sudden gust of wind tore through the trees, sending branches cracking. Rain poured from the sky in sheets so heavy it drowned the laughter. The boys cursed, their voices scrambling, boots clattering as they leaped from the porch to escape the sudden downpour. Within moments, their shouts faded into the storm. Silence returned. broken only by the sound of rain rushing against the windows and through the broken glass on the floor. Jack's chest heaved. He turned to Henry, who stood staring at the piano, his hands trembling. The old man slowly lowered himself onto the bench. He ran his palm gently across the keys, as though reassuring the instrument. His lips quivered, and he whispered, "They can't understand, but we will not stop." Jack knelt and began picking shards of glass from the floor, careful not to cut his hands. Henry bent down too, helping in silence. Together, they gathered the broken pieces, dropping them into a box by the wall. The storm outside roared, but inside, the house stood strong. When the last shard was cleared, Henry placed the photograph of Elsie back in its place, upright and unbroken. He stroked the edge of the frame. "She's still here," he said, his voice firm, as though speaking not only to Jack but to himself. Jack sat beside him, his hands trembling with anger and fear. "What if they come back?" Henry looked at him, his eyes burning with quiet resolve. "Then we'll play louder." The storm thundered again, but Jack's heart felt steadier. Together, they pressed the first notes, soft but defiant. Rain hammered the roof, thunder shook the windows, yet the music rose above it, fragile but unbroken, like a candle flame refusing to die in the wind. For the first time, Jack realized this wasn't only about grief anymore. It was about defiance, about keeping alive what others wanted forgotten. And in that moment, he understood music was not just memory. It was resistance. The storm had passed, but its echoes stayed in the walls of the house and in Jack's chest. For days he could still hear the crash of glass, the cruel voices, the threat that the whole house might fall to ruin because people could not understand grief that was not theirs. Yet when he came back each evening, the piano still stood, scarred but unbroken, and Henry sat waiting as though the night of shattered windows had only strengthened his resolve. They patched the window with boards and cloth, though cold drafts still slipped through. Henry sold what little he had left, an old watch, a pair of boots, even his wedding ring too, by second-hand wood and nails. Jack helped him carry them, the boy's young hands and the old man's weathered ones working side by side. They repaired the broken shutters, tightened the porch steps, swept the floor clean of dust that had clung for years. It was not perfect. The house still leaned with age, but with every nail, every sweep of the broom, the silence lifted a little more. The piano, though, bore the deepest wound. Some keys had chipped when shards of glass fell across them. The surface was scratched, its old polish stripped by rain. Jack's heart ached when he saw the scars, but Henry only shook his head gently. "Scars don't end a song," he said. "They give it weight." One Saturday morning, Henry surprised Jack by leading him to a small shop in town. The bell over the door rang weakly as they entered. Rows of instruments lined the dusty shelves, violins with missing strings, guitars with cracked necks, brass horns that no longer shone. In the corner, under a tarp, stood another piano, smaller and newer than the one in the house. Henry placed a hand on it and turned to the shopkeeper. His voice shook but was steady. "How much?" The shopkeeper frowned. "It's out of tune, not worth much, 50 maybe." Henry opened his coat and pulled out a pouch. Inside clinked the coins he had gathered from selling the last of his belongings. He placed it on the counter without a word. Jack's eyes widened. "Henry, you don't have to." The old man stopped him with a gentle hand. "I do. I lost her once, Jack. I won't lose her again." To silence. The shopkeeper agreed to deliver it by cart. That evening, the two of them stood as the men carried the piano into the old house. The room felt different as soon as it was set down. Not that it erased the scars of the first piano. Henry would never let that one go, but this new one gave them a second voice, a way to build rather than only to mourn. Henry lowered himself onto the bench. He pressed a key. The note was sour, the string stretched. Jack winced, but Henry smiled faintly. "Out of tune," he said. "Like me, but it can be fixed." Over the next week, they worked together. They tightened strings, cleaned the wood, and polished the keys. Jack read books from the library on tuning, and Henry guided him with a careful ear. The sound improved, little by little, until one night Jack pressed the middle C and it rang clear, like a bell cutting through fog. That night, Jack played as Henry listened. He began with Elsie's tunes from the notebook, but soon found himself wandering, creating new melodies that lifted rather than sank. His fingers danced across the keys, no longer weighed only by grief, but carried by something brighter. Henry watched, his eyes glistening. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. Jack paused. Hear what? The change, Henry said. When you first came, your music wept. Now it breathes. It lifts. It's as if she's here, and your mother too, urging you on. Jack felt warmth in his chest. For the first time since his mother's death, he did not feel only pain when he played. He felt her beside him, smiling, proud. A week later, the town held its summer gathering in the square. Lanterns lit the night. Families sold pies. Children chased each other through the grass. And on the small wooden stage, a space stood open for music. Henry looked at Jack, his face firm but kind. It's time, he said. Jack froze. Time for what? Henry placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. To play for them, for her, for your mother, for us. Fear coiled in Jack's stomach. The thought of standing before the crowd, of pressing keys under so many eyes, made his hands tremble. I can't, he whispered. Henry squeezed his shoulder. Yes, you can. Promise me. The words struck Jack like lightning. His mother's last breath, her faint voice whispering, promise me, flooded back. He felt the tears sting, but he nodded. I'll try. When they reached the square, Henry spoke to the organizer. Within minutes, Jack found himself seated on the small stage, the piano before him, the crowd buzzing with curiosity. Whispers rippled. Isn't that the boy from the haunted house? What's he doing up there? Jack's chest tightened. His hands hovered above the keys. The memory of the boys throwing stones returned. What if they laughed? What if they mocked him? Then he saw Henry in the crowd, standing tall despite his bent frame, holding Elsie's photograph against his chest. Their eyes met, and Henry nodded once, firmly, as though telling him, play louder. Jack closed his eyes. He pressed the first notes. At first his hands shook, the sound uncertain. The crowd murmured, but then he remembered the nights in the house, the lamplight, the sound of rain, Henry's stories, his mother's promise. His fingers steadied. The melody grew. He played Elsie's tune, the Willow Creek waltz, then wove into it his own notes, strong and bright. The two melodies danced together, past and present, meeting in harmony. The square fell silent. Even the children stopped their games. The lanterns flickered, and the night air seemed to hold its breath by the time Jack finished. The last note lingered like a heartbeat. The crowd erupted in applause. Some clapped politely, others with real wonder. Jack sat stunned, his chest heaving, his eyes wet. Henry clapped too, tears streaming down his face, but his smile was wide, proud, and alive. That night, when they walked home together, Jack felt different. Not cured, not free of grief, but lighter. His mother's voice no longer haunted him. It carried him. Henry spoke softly as they reached the porch. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Not just Elsie's music, not just her memory. Hope. Jack swallowed, unable to speak. He looked at the old house, its windows patched, its rooms scarred but alive again. Music had not only healed the silence, it had rebuilt it into something new, and deep in his heart. Jack knew this was only the beginning. The summer warmth lingered long after the lanterns of the town square had burned out. For weeks, people spoke of the boy who had played on stage, of the way his music had silenced the crowd and filled the night with something they could not name. Some called it talent, others called it a gift. But for Jack and Henry, it was not about talent or gifts. It was about promises kept, wounds shared, and the way music could keep love alive even when death had tried to take it away. The old house at the edge of the woods changed to no longer did it sit in silence. Each evening its windows glowed with lamplight, and the sound of piano drifted across the yard like breath through open lungs. Some townsfolk still shook their heads, muttering about ghosts, but others began to pause at the gate and listen. A few even left flowers on the fence, not because they understood, but because they felt something stir in them when the notes reached their ears. Jack's visits became part of his life, as natural as breathing. After school, after the ache of days that still carried his mother's absence, he would walk to the house. Henry would be waiting. Together they played, spoke little, but healed much. But time is never gentle. One autumn evening, as the leaves burned red and gold, Jack found Henry sitting on the porch, his hands trembling more than usual. The old man's face looked pale, tired in a way Jack had not seen before. "You're late," Henry said softly, though there was no anger in his voice. Jack dropped his bag and sat beside him. "Are you all right?" Henry smiled faintly. "Just old bones, old heart." He looked toward the woods, the fading sun painting his face in gold. I've lived longer than I thought I would, but I think my time is nearly done. Jack's chest tightened. Don't say that. Henry turned to him, his eyes gentle, filled with a kind of sorrow that was not fear but acceptance. Jack, every song ends, but what matters is the echo it leaves. Jack swallowed hard. You're not going anywhere. Henry chuckled softly. If only music could keep me. He placed a frail hand on Jack's shoulder. But it can keep her. And it can keep your mother too. Through you. Jack felt his throat burn. He wanted to argue, to deny, but Henry's words settled deep in his chest, heavy and true. That evening, they played together again. Henry's hands trembled so badly that he missed keys, but Jack filled the gaps, his younger fingers steadying the melody. It was as if the old man was passing something through the music, a weight, a gift, a final promise. Days passed. Henry grew weaker. Some evenings he could not climb the porch steps without Jack's help. Other nights he simply sat and listened. As Jack played, his eyes closed, his lips whispering the names of tunes Elsie once wrote. And then came the night Henry did not rise from bed. The house was colder that evening. Jack hurried down the hall, his heart thundering, and found Henry lying beneath blankets in a small room that smelled of age and medicine. The old man's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling like a tired wave. Jack knelt beside him. I'm here, he whispered. Henry's eyes opened, faint but still bright. He smiled weakly. Good boy. His hand searched and found Jack's. His grip was soft, frail, but steady. Play for me, one last time. Jack's eyes blurred. With tears, he wanted to say no, that he couldn't, that it was too much. But he remembered the night of stones, Henry's voice telling him to play louder. The night at the square, his mother's last words. He nodded. He sat at the piano. The photograph of Elsie still stood upright, her smile timeless. The notebook lay open to a page with scribbled notes and a small drawing of a bird. Jack pressed the keys. The first notes came shaky, but then steadied. He wove Elsie's tunes with his own, filling the house with sound. As he played, Henry's breathing slowed, his lips moved, whispering words Jack could not hear. And when the last note lingered, hanging in the air like a star, Henry's chest stilled. Silence followed. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence after a song has finished, when the echo still trembles in the heart. Jack sat frozen. His tears fell onto the keys. He pressed his palms against the wood, his shoulders shaking. Goodbye, he whispered. Thank you. The house seemed to breathe with him. The photograph of Elsie watched, the notebook resting where Henry had left it. Jack wiped his face and stood. He looked around the room, at the walls that had once been filled with silence, now filled with memories, with music, with promises. He closed the notebook gently, tucked it under his arm, and whispered, I'll keep playing, for both of you. Years passed. Willow Creek changed. The bakery closed. The church bell rang again after decades, and new families moved into town. But in the square, every summer, people gathered to hear Jack play. He became known not just as a pianist, but as the keeper of the town's soul. His music carried both sorrow and hope, weaving grief and joy together in ways words never could. And on the night of the autumn festival, he always ended with one piece, the last song of Willow Creek. It began with Elsie's notes, soft and bright, and grew into his own, strong and defiant. And when the final chord rang, he would close his eyes and feel them, both his mother and Henry standing beside him, proud and alive in the music. Because some promises are never broken. They live in every note, every echo, every heart that listens. The end.